Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, hard to swallow, we examine farming, food and Brexit. The government has once again postponed border checks for food being imported to the UK from the EU because it would increase inflation. That's the fifth time the deadline has been put back. But British food exporters have faced additional checks when they sell their goods into Europe, putting them at a competitive disadvantage. It's one version of taking back control, I suppose, but hardly the Brexit dividend promised by the Leave campaign. Keir Starmer has said that if Labour gets into power, he wants to renegotiate our deal with the EU, but a return to the single market is not on the cards. Meanwhile, a post-Brexit trade agreement with Australia has left many farmers fearful for the future. Cheaper meat imports may be good for the consumer, but flying in food from the far side of the world is hardly compatible with our net zero commitment and will do nothing for our food security. So how should those who make and trade our food deal with the post-Brexit landscape? We're going to be hearing from Liz Webster, a beef farmer from Wiltshire, founder of Save British Farming, and Shane Brennan, Chief Executive of the Cold Chain Federation, representing businesses who get your food from A to B. Before that, though, just a quick reminder that the Byline Times podcast is funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times. That's our brilliant monthly newspaper, which combines the best of our online offerings with content that you can't read anywhere else. Head over to bylinetimes.com to take out a subscription. And if you have already done so, thank you very much indeed. Well, welcome then, Liz. Welcome, Shane. Shane, just take us through, firstly, kind of an idiot's guide for me of what was due to happen at the start of October.
So on the 31st of October, we were going to see the first iteration of import controls on the food we bring into the UK from the European Union. And obviously that includes Ireland. And on October, it would have been the requirement to start getting certification, particularly of meat and dairy goods. And that means a vet signing off on all goods that leave a European depot to come to the UK. And then from the 31st of January, so 3 months later, we would have seen the start of border control. So the chance that a lorry might be stopped at the UK border and inspected as part of what would be a kind of coherent border control, the sort of border we run with the rest of the world. And what's happened is that those two deadlines have been pushed back 3 months retrospectively. So the paperwork requirements will now start on the 31st of January, and then 3 months later, we'll have the border controls.
And what would the impact of those additional checks have been, and what will it ultimately be?
I mean, it's massively disruptive. This happens to UK-based exporters of food on the first day that we left the single market. And we saw a paralysis run through our food exporters at that time. And our estimation, our message to government in the run into the deadlines is that that will happen again. Probably not on the same scale necessarily, because that happened during the middle of COVID, the Omicron variant. But it will be a significant awakening amongst European businesses that this requirement is there. They will pause and reflect on what they want to do now that these paperwork checks are required. Then once they've realised what's now involved in inserting the UK, they will take a decision. Some will decide, well, we just need to get on with it, and some will be some way prepared anyway and will carry on. Others will reduce or simplify what they do in terms of sending goods to the UK, and others will stop completely. And that will create opportunity for others. So it will just be a significant restructuring of the supply chain that we currently rely on to get goods into the UK from the European Union. That's obviously very significant when you think about the sorts of markets that are on our doorstep. And by that, I mean the Irish market and the sort of Northern European, France, Holland, Belgium markets, who have for 30 years become integrated into our fast-moving supply chains.
So if you're an EU exporter, you will have, as I understand it, to attach an export health certificate to your goods coming into the UK. If there's an animal involved, it will involve a sign-off by a vet. All of this is going to cost money, and this is the fear of the government and why it's been postponed on this occasion. This is going to add to the cost of our food in the UK.
Absolutely. It's going to cost money for the certificate. It's going to cost money for the vet. It's going to cost money for the haulier, because the haulage options will be reduced, because a lot of hauliers will extract themselves from doing that kind of work because it's so complicated. So yeah, all of that has inflationary pressure on the cost. But then businesses have to make a decision on that. I mean, whether they want to continue to do that trade or not. And some will and some won't.
And if some exporters from the EU to the UK decide not to continue with that trade just because it's too much hassle for them, then is there a risk that we will see food shortages again?
If people extract themselves, that creates a gap in the market. Now, the gap in the market might be filled by domestic producers in some cases. And I know there's some that believe that the right answer for all of this is just to have a significant increase in the amount of food we purchase coming from within the UK shores. However, I think that my estimation is that some of that will happen, but in reality, a lot of what will happen will be a slight rebalancing towards more goods coming in from further away. Because actually, the other thing that happens with these changes is because these changes apply not just to European businesses, but to the whole world servicing the UK. And so places like Australia and New Zealand, who have the opportunity to import beef into the UK, will find a slight deregulation of what's required of them compared to what they have to do now. And so that would naturally suggest a balancing somewhat. I don't think like a wholesale, but a percentage move towards more goods coming from out further afield.
And Liz, you're caught in the eye of this storm as a farmer, a beef and arable farmer. What's the situation look like for you at the moment, where we have this strange situation where British food producers are handicapped relative to their EU counterparts?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible. And I liken it to getting excited about Brexit being sort of going global, like going into the World Cup. But you send your team out with chains around their legs, to be sensible, particularly with geopolitics becoming so unstable in this new world. If I was in charge of Brexit, the first thing I would have done would be to make sure that we dig for Britain and we've got a solid food security. But actually, this government have done the opposite. Not only do we face these significant problems with exports, they've also removed our funding structure, particularly worse for English farmers than the devolved government. So to get any support now, we have to take land out of production. That is what the government are encouraging us to do. So that actually then leads to more intensive farming, because if you want to remain competitive, you've got to up your production numbers and do it in less space. So that means more factory farming, which is the opposite of what the supposed new sustainable world is meant to be about. It's really frustrating. There's not enough conversation about it because political parties are trying to ignore Brexit. And all of the time, our food security is weakening. And if we do fall to rely on food coming from further away, as Shane just said, if there is another war, say perhaps by China deciding to swoop into Taiwan, then we're in a very dangerous position because less food will come in from Europe and less food is being produced here. And we're almost putting ourselves back to the place that we had in the last two world wars when we couldn't get food in here because of being an island and isolated. Having no food security is actually having no sovereignty because it means other countries can hold you to ransom for food.
Shane's raised the possibility that as EU exporters find it more difficult to sell their food into the UK, that does potentially create an opportunity for British food producers to step into the gap. Obviously, we have our own domestic market on our doorstep. So why can't farmers like you then move to fill that gap?
Well, as I said, I think some will be thinking that because they will intensify and you will see more factory farming coming in. That is the only way to compete in that marketplace. But if UK and EU exporters both had balanced checks, then there probably would have been more of an opportunity. When you look at the greenhouse growers, for instance, or say the chicken producers who are reliant on energy, had significant rises in costs because of energy. And the government has done nothing to help us. And our fertilizer producers, they're closed now. So we're 100% reliant on imported fertilizers. They haven't done anything to help our growers with these massive price increases, which means that a lot of British producers have thought, well, actually, I'm not going to bother to produce food because it's too much risk. So many of the greenhouse growers I know are actually not going to be planting this winter, which means to rely on Europe for those foods. So that's why we're stuck now. It's like deciding to drive into a narrow lane and think, well, we'll just keep going and turn around later. And there's no way of turning around because there's no answers to this. And you're looking at inflationary problems and shortages, because relying on food coming from further away, particularly fresh foods, cucumbers, peppers, tomatoes, all those sort of things, mean that we'll have shortages. So it's a failure of policy and decisions by this government, and a failure of opposition in not actually saying, look, guys, this is what's going on. And everybody's pretending that everything's okay. And we've had a fantastic food system because we've benefited from being in the single market. But now it's getting tougher and tougher, which is why there's less fresh produce on the supermarket shelves all of the time. And that's only set to get worse as we go into the winter, in my view. And it's a failure. And at some stage, the British people will really see this, and there's going to be a backlash. So I can't really express my frustration and anger at the irresponsibility of our political leaders. And I include all of them in this. And everybody's trying to get them to engage in the issue. But there's nothing more important than food. And it's been taken for granted. People don't understand that food comes from farms. And also it's better for all of us, as well as with climate change, to eat food which is in season, locally sourced. The smaller the supply chain, the better.
There's a lot in what Liz said, and I have huge sympathy with her frustration overall. I'm not as pessimistic as Liz, though. I have to say, I don't have any significant belief in the policy ambition of this particular administration, but I do think there is opportunity to have a holistic approach to our food policy. I do think that a balance of sources of where we get food from, very much focused on simple and local being the dominant supply chain that we rely on for our food, but also understanding the opportunity of bringing goods in from other parts of the world, within our near neighbours in Europe and also further afield, is all part of an integrated, secure, diverse food supply chain. And I'm still optimistic that the combination of the farming community, the business community, the supply chain operations can achieve that balance. We're certainly in a stronger place here in the UK than they are in other parts of the world. I mean, I look with significant concern at some issues that are happening in places like the Middle East and in Africa right now. So I think we need to be careful about being too alarmist about what food security means for us in the near and medium term. However, Liz is right that it has to come from a very big picture approach to food security being a clear policy ambition of government and a clear sense of integrated policy decisions. And we need that to start to come clear, because the frustration that Liz expresses is there in lots of parts of the supply chain because we don't feel like we've got coherent leadership at this stage.
And the issues around regulation that we've talked about, eventually the UK will introduce those import checks from the European Union. It may even be when their next deadline is in January, who can say? So that will equalise some of the unfair competition that currently exists between UK and EU food producers. Is that the end of the story? Keir Starmer is talking about not rejoining the single market, but reducing the friction for importers and exporters. What can be done short of rejoining the single market that would help make that easier?
Two things. Yes, you're absolutely right that we are not in the European Union anymore. We have a border with the European Union. We have to control that border. That's our obligation under international law. A mature, sensible state has to have some kind of control system in place. And that will come in probably before the end of before the next election. And so it probably will be on the next deadlines. You're also right to say that this is an ongoing process. This idea that Brexit gets done, it's a fallacy of political rhetoric, not a reality of the process. We have to talk to our neighbours every day on an ongoing basis forevermore, and that is what we will do. Keir Starmer is talking in particular in this specific instance about the idea of veterinary alignment. So we made a decision in our agreement with the EU to not align at all on food safety standards, to have complete divergence. Now, that's a choice we made, and it's a choice we potentially can unmake if we have a willing European negotiator on the other side of the table. So certainly we encourage that idea, whatever the political leadership that's taking that forward, that is the right long-term ambition to come back more into alignment with our European neighbours. Whether or not a Keir Starmer administration could achieve that within the timeframes that they're talking about is hard to know, because it takes two to tango, and we need to know what the European Union's view on that would be.
Sure, but it's kind of a microscopic unpicking of the detail rather than a one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've already diverged. That's one of the crucial things. Back when we were making the agreement, we were completely 100% aligned in our food rules. The minute we exited, that's changed. So we had to go back into alignment first, and then we'd have to go through it. And it's painstaking. This stuff is painstaking at every level, and it's ongoing. So it's not at one fell swoop decision. It takes time.
I mean, at least from your point of view, you'd just like to see us rejoin the EU, I think.
Well, yeah, because, what's the advantage? If you were going to do Brexit completely, you do need to diverge and deregulate. If we're in this sort of halfway house, it doesn't actually make any sense. We've got no advantages at all. And we're just there as a sort of vassal state of the EU.
This was a point you made to me earlier before we started recording, Liz. You said, in a way, the current situation is the opposite of what Brexiters wanted, that in some ways now we are more dependent on the EU. We are rule takers and not rule makers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we are. And the reason we've diverged the most is because actually it's the EU that's moved on. We've been stuck in a no man's land. I don't know if the plan was initially to go straight into an American trade deal because Trump was still in power then. But what they should have done was get the borders sorted with all of the checks on this side, which Britain failed to do right from the outset. And now we're stuck in this place where to bring those checks in makes significant problems for food supply and for inflation. So I can't see a government before the election deciding to bring in something which the consumer is going to feel quite quickly. I think it will probably be delayed again, is my guess, but who knows?
Well, there is form for that. But let me ask you, Liz. I mean, one of the arguments for Brexit is this freedom that it gives us to negotiate our own trade deals independent of the EU. So that, for example, there is now a trade deal with Australia, which will impact quite significantly on farming. And that's being talked up by the government as meaning lower food prices, for example. From a farmer point of view, how do you see it?
These trade deals are cataclysmic. They're dreadful for Britain. We already had good access to Australia and New Zealand markets. All those deals did was open Britain up to Australia and New Zealand. And Australia in particular is a threat to us because they produce huge amounts of beef, and in a very different way to the way that we farm. They've got different climate, they've got more land. And so, yes, it is a threat to us. And as I pointed out earlier, it all leads in the direction of more factory farming at home, which most consumers are not happy with that. And most farmers here in Britain like the way we farm. Our country looks the way it looks because of the way we farm. So that's the sadness that I feel with Brexit, that it's leading us towards that place. And I think all that Brexit's done is actually show that we did need to be in Europe to get things done. And since Brexit, we can't get the checks sorted. Europe did. And so we're in a disadvantage. We did trade deals, but we're at a disadvantage again. So there are no advantages to Brexit. I can't find any whatsoever. So that's why I do feel that for us to be global again and be a part of the global movement, that we are better off to accept that Brexit has failed and retrace our steps at some stage to go back into Europe. We're safer, we're stronger in the European Union.
Shane, one of the issues early on after Brexit was the availability of staff, EU-based truckers, for example, who came and settled for a time at least in the UK. Has that issue now sorted itself out? Are we seeing fewer trucker shortages, which had an impact on the ability to deliver food?
So right now we're in the calm after the storm. We had a very, very precarious and dangerous period around the end of the COVID lockdowns and the change of our immigration rules. But what happened in the subsequent time is some significant interventions by businesses, some changing of wage levels and resourcing decisions and the like. But actually, the biggest thing is that there's been a sort of, not quite a recession, but a significant downturn in demand. And that has equalized with the amount of labor available. So actually, we are in the same situation we were. However, What that does tell us is that our labour market in the food supply chain is incredibly fragile. And as it fluctuates, and it does, the ability to flex upwards with our labour to meet an increase in demand when that comes is a worry.
What you seem to be saying then is that we've solved the problem of trucker shortages essentially because demand has declined, because have been for the last 2 or 3 years on the brink of recession. It's not because we have enough truckers to meet demand in a more positive time than this, but demand has slackened, so there isn't quite such an intensive demand for labour.
Yes, I am saying that, although the period we were talking about where the shortage was headline news was an incredible demand surge, and it was a readjustment after COVID. This was a reopening period that saw dramatic increases in demand for supply chain services. So there was a peak of demand that was above the average. We have gone now down below the average. So I think equalisation and then a decline in demand is the reasons why our labour is okay today, but it's fragile.
One of the most important things I take from our conversation with Liz, Shane, is the importance of food security. Obviously, she's talking about it from the point of view as a primary food producer. When you look at it from a logistics point of view, there are so many things that can get in the way, whether they're road conditions, whether it's the availability of labour, whether it is the kind of friction that we're talking about as people cross borders. Either way, food security, I suspect, because of the big geopolitical movements that we're seeing, is likely to become more important, I suspect, in the years ahead. How can we best insulate ourselves against some of the shifts that may come our way and might disrupt food security?
Insulating ourselves is a term that worries me. I think the geopolitical reality is that countries and markets are turning in on themselves rather than looking at how they interact with each other. But you're right, food security is on the agenda. It is a fundamental part of our agenda for the next 30, 40 years. Every country and every market has to have a food security plan. It has to be thinking about it in terms of what we produce, what we store, what infrastructure we have to move stuff around, and how we retail it, and seeing it from that point of view because of the geopolitical realities we're up against and the climate realities we're up against. And that's where supply chain infrastructure, like the cold chain, has to be something that we see as critical national infrastructure. And we have to be thinking about it in terms of not state control, but state and common understanding of what capacity we have and what levels we're at in terms of security. That's just a realistic way to deal with being resilient to what's coming in terms of our changing political, social, and environmental context.
Taking a strategic view, really, Liz, you mentioned earlier on how we are exposed globally in that there is no UK-based fertilizer manufacturer. Now, most people wouldn't think too much of that, except when you have a conflict like the one between Ukraine and Russia, which reduces the ability of one of the world's primary fertilizer producers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive worry. I suppose some of us, I'm certainly one of these people that looks ahead, and I'd rather be over-prepared than under-prepared. And this government failed to give us a food plan. We had a food strategy, which was written by Henry Dimbleby, but that was just a diet plan. It wasn't a food plan. And there still isn't a food plan. We need what I would call it a dig for Britain approach to ensuring that we have good basis of food supply here. We'll never be completely food sufficient. That's not going to happen. But we've lost a considerable amount of time in messing about. We've done this right from the outset and actually really put some investment into our food production here. We wouldn't be in such a weak position. It's disappointing, but it's also worrying.
Liz Webster, thank you. Thanks also to Shane Brennan. I'm Adrian Goldberg. You've been listening to the Byline Times podcast, which is funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times. That's our brilliant monthly newspaper, which combines the best of our online offerings with content that you can't read anywhere else. Please think about taking out a subscription over at bylinetimes.com. This episode was produced by me, Adrian Goldberg, and Harvey White in Birmingham. It's a We Bring audio production for the Byline Times. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, cheers. Bye-bye.